Pretty tactical. Look at that. Oh, the transcript is going. All right, so let's get back to this. Who tried this weekend? Anybody? Anyone? Anyone? How was it?
Not me, but our foreign exchange student, Amar, who's from Bosnia, tried trade cheese for the first time. And then I told him about this and he said he was gonna try it, so I got to get on it.
Did the cheese change his life? And we use the
Yeah,
word,
kinda.
we use it cheese, that word loosely when we talk about that. The petroleum-based cheese product.
Yeah, someone brought it and he had Ritz and he like sat there and he's like showing everyone, he's like, look how cool this is. Yeah.
You know.
Like influenced them.
Yeah. That's what America's become. Okay, moving on. So we got American civilization moving westward, trade, and what was the other reason? For manifest destiny. Land, and what was it called? By spreading slavery out to protect slavery actually. So diffusion. A couple things we'll get to really quick today. Got to talk a little bit about the expansion westward, a little bit about the Oregon Trail, not a lot. We can do this. Let's do it. Oh, what was the carriage trade? What product did they like for the carriage trade? At least 1840. Yeah, beaver felt hats. Then all of a sudden, everybody went to what? Silk. No coincidence that big demand for silk, opium war soon after opening up China. So immigration west. Settlers did go west, and about 250,000 immigrants. Now, immigrants mean within their own country. This is a little bit misleading because some did leave the country by going to Mexico or Oregon. But the Panic of 1837 definitely encouraged a lot of people. But to go westward, you need money. This is not for the poor. For the vast majority of people, they could not afford it. Poor people could not do this, lower class. They had to have enough money that they decide it's not worth it in the West. There's a shortage of land. Land prices were so high, I'll go take it in Oregon. If you had enough money, the fastest and most efficient way would take a fast boat called the clipper ship, really thin, long, narrow sailing ship, ships and go all the way around Argentina. That was the fastest and the safest. I know that seems weird to go all the way around Argentina, but they were also just beginning to go to Nicaragua, cross there, and then that's coming soon. Steamships are just coming too, and you can see the big, even 1840, there isn't a huge influx here, but then we'll get California. Gee, I wonder what's going to happen here in California. And then the influx into Utah, which we'll get to, and they are very much related. So this is soon going to be dubbed Empire upon the Trails. As the United States pushes westward, they're literally going to create an empire. And the most important trail would be the Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail from Independence, Missouri. Independence, Missouri is right next to Kansas City. If you go there, there's a spot. This is where the Oregon Trail began. They asked us to do this. But it goes across this tough, desolate, dry plains. If you've been across Wyoming and southern Idaho, whew, that's a hard carry. And eastern Oregon. Yeah. We'll get to this in here. What a weird thing to say in class again. That's another one. Oh, we'll get, and you're like, oh, cool. Okay, so, yeah, here's the Santa Fe Trail, the Spanish Trail, which will go to California. Spanish Trail will become key a little bit later on. There'll be a California cutoff to go to this part of California. The best known group that would try to break away from the Oregon Trail, they left a little bit too late. And they cut off on the California Trail and took a path that they thought would be faster, turned out to be significantly slower, and got caught in the winter there. Yes.
And then they were towards the east.
Yes, that's something that turned to cannibalism. Yeah, called the Donner Party. Not necessarily each other, because some people obviously some were eating and some were not. They were the dying ones, yeah. But they turned to that. This there'll be certain spots along the way. This is actually from the 1890s, but it gives you an idea how small these Conestoga wagons were. And you have to understand something about this. March or April, gotta decide when to leave too early. Obviously, you get the spring rains, but the later you start, the longer it's going to be. And you're basically saying, I'm going to spend the next 7 months and I'm going to walk to Oregon. I want you to ponder that for a second. You rarely rode. You might ride a little bit, but there's no shock absorbers. It's a miserable, hard, bumpy ride. Unless you're sick or ill, there's no room because all your possessions and supplies have got to be in there. And so you're basically just saying, I'm going to walk to Oregon. And this is kind of a different breed. And they were really, I mean, just, it's kind of amazing, the idea that we're just going to go. And so one thing I want to show, though, here's another one from that Hudson River School. And this is that romanticizing the West. I put the name up here so I wouldn't forget the name, even though I know I wouldn't, but Oregon Trail. And going into the sunset, but it's supposed to be, you know, like bringing civilization westward. And look at the cliffs. I mean, this is very romanticized version. I have to be clear about this. No place like this exists. These are people who never left New York. And this is their dream of what's the West has got to be like. As it turned out, no, Southern Wyoming is not like this. Yeah.
And they just kind of like made it less romantic by throwing in stuff like dying. This is very
We're kind of stuck on dysentery, right? Yeah, it turned out to be a much more difficult trip. But you're going to see this anytime there's going to be people moving westward. They romanticize it. It's great. Rain will follow the plow. That's another story for later on. So here's the trail. And along the way, there'll be certain spots where they would mark. Basically, we made it to here, made it to here. So Chimney Rock, Scotts Bluff right here. Fort Laramie was one of the last outposts, and this was a hard area right here. You go through. Basically, that winter there, or that summer here, because there's very little water. The water's there is really alkaline. It's salty. This is right where the Salt Lake Basin is. And so the water just kind of flows into one spot. And so all the various salts or whatever might be minerals in the water just kind of settle into the groundwater, which even if you dig a well, it's really very salty. Does anyone ever taste like an alkaline ground? Salt. Where at?
But I went to the Dead Sea once.
You have that really salty. And like all over this area right here, all the wells are like salty. It's a little bit here, but not too bad. If you go further out in the valley, it's a tiny bit more salty, but you don't really taste it. But if you go like eastern Montana, eastern Wyoming, it's salty. Not quite like the Dead Sea, or for that matter, the Great Salt Lake. But, for example, that's Chimney Rock in western Nebraska. And it used to be about twice as high. I don't know why they called it Chimney, could be any reason. But that was like, we made it Chimney Rock. That's a big step. Scotts Bluff, we made it. And Fort Laramie, we made it. Fort Laramie is close. We make it to there, get lots of supplies, and head westward. And here's the size of one of these prairie schooners or Conestoga wagons. I mean, they're tiny. It's just so small. And for the most part, the tribes along that area, let them go through, just get out. Get through. And you can see one packed, and this is actually from the 1870s, but here are a couple families that have gone through. This is 1850s, that's 1860s. Photography is brand new in the 1840s. So we got a few pictures, but they were tough. And yes, a lot would die along the way. And Independence Rock might be my favorite spot. That's in Wyoming. And that was if you got there by July, you got a pretty good shot. You're going to be okay when you come in the winter. And they would carve in their names or put in with the axle grease. Some of that axle grease remains. And it was like, I could almost imagine like they got to this rock and it's like, I made it here. We made it. I want people to know I made it. They put that on the rock. That's really cool. I just think that's really great. But this gives you an idea how tough this would be. Here is in southern Wyoming. Water, and here is just a little bit west of Independence Rock. And when they had to go downhill, the water would run down and make these wagon ruts even worse. Kind of dig almost like a trench around it. very tough, miserable trip over. Not that many went per se, but remember, when they went and they crossed into Mexico for a short time and then went into Oregon, they brought the flag with them. They thought of themselves as American citizens. In Oregon, they wanted to get to the Willamette Valley. San Francisco, this area just north, they're called Sonoma, right here. We've seen this great agricultural. Now to go there, it's famous. Great agriculture and olive trees. But thousands went, but our group we have to get to very quickly that went. Oh, and then of course, speaking of this, yes, you might have dysentery. So yeah, what is this from? You never play that game? So that's what we're doing for the rest of the semester. We're just going to play that game. My expectation is you just have to know everything. It's really accurate. This must be from the really old version of the game, like 1984. Not one of the high-tech versions from 1990. So we must talk a little bit about the Church of Latter-day Saints or the Mormons who went westward. And the reason why is because they would have such great influence here, but also personify one of the, or would represent one of the greatest movements, internal immigration. Well, immigration means moving within a country. They're technically immigrants because they're going to leave the country. They're going to Mexico. And just a couple of things about, we mentioned them before, but they came from that burnt over district, and these churches, almost all were Protestant, would rise up and fall, had some similar characteristics. They were all relatively anti-slavery, but also very pragmatic, and all really started right in here, that area of New York. And right there is one of the first pictures. You can see a little bit of the painting. When they would get these first pictures, they would paint around the edges. So you see these kind of weird shape. But this one, some of the pictures, they would paint the cheeks pink. So they would make them look more lifelike, which of course makes them more creepy looking if you see them. But Joseph Smith, he would write what's going to be known as the Book of Mormon from golden plates that he translated. We're not going to go into great detail about this, but originally it read almost like, and he almost presented it like a history of the Americas. But then it turned into a book that, at least to this faith, will be equal to, or close to equal, it's complex, to the Bible. And in a couple of things we have to get to. This was going to be the restoration of the proper church. So basically what it's saying is that the other churches were going away from the original teachings of Christianity and Jesus, and so they are all wrong. They would not be alone here. A lot of the groups in the burnt over district believe this. This was not unusual. And they had disagreements about the nature of God. This goes back to, is God and Jesus, are God and Jesus the same and both gods, or is there a God and Jesus is a human? This goes back to the original bit of Christianity, Arianism. So this is not a new argument, but they believe that there was a difference. And this goes against almost every mainstream Protestant and of course Catholicism, and the idea that every other church was wrong and going on the wrong path. They're going to make enemies, but I should be clear, they weren't alone. There were a lot of groups who believe this. Yeah.
At least the dates are from let's get from are from let's declare war, last one standing, that's the nature of God.
Yeah, that's about, or fight to the death like the Byzantines did in the red and green and different, and they would just fight, they would brawl in the streets. And so at that, they're also they're part of this millennial phase that believe that the judgment day is near. In fact, that's the whole idea about Latter-day Saints. It will be in the latter day or after the judgment day. And their belief actually for Latter-day Saints were any believers, not a heck of a lot different than almost all the Protestant faiths. But you combine this with a little bit differences here to a lot of the mainstream churches, they were radically different. And so there's going to be a lot of persecution against persecution against Mormons as they went into Ohio. In fact, I think I got this down. Oh, and then he also talked about creating a theocratic democracy. So a religious state. So it's a democracy with the ideas of the American Republic, very important, this idea of the American Republic, but also a theocracy, which means a religious state. This terrified people who were fearful of the doctrine of a separation of church and state. And they would try in Ohio, a couple times in Missouri. In Missouri, the governor would finally ban them, basically saying they must be exterminated, and they would flee to Nauvoo, Illinois. If you ever get a chance, Nauvoo is very well preserved, and it's not only about the history of the Latter-day Saints, but there's also a major stop on the Underground Railroad. Do you know what the Underground Railroad is? And it's historically a really neat town. But at Nauvoo, this would be their escape for a homeland, or Zion. Zionism was a homeland. Well, in my context, in my life, I always think in terms of Zionism as Jews who were scattered by the Romans looking for a homeland going into the 20th century. That's what I think of. But it's a similar idea. And they controlled the city government, even though there were a lot of non-Mormons there. And so there really was this kind of a rivalry between people who were part of the church and in the church, and also within Mormonism, there are other people who thought they had their own revelations, and there was a lot of fighting and infighting. Smith ran a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor, and this is the golden age of newspapers. The printing process got a lot faster. They could really get newspapers quick, and so in it laid out news, but also these are kind of propaganda arms. And in here, a couple different things. After what happened in Missouri, he would create his own private militia. This is a painting of him acting like a general, Joseph Smith. And the militia, a lot of private militias. This was lots of militias, all kinds of uniforms going around. And then he announced he was going to run for president. Now, he didn't really have much of a chance to actually become president. That wasn't the point. To the people nearby, it's like, this is going to force us to go a different way. And I should add, somebody that just popped in my head, somebody from Montana just announced they're running for president. Literally, just announced it. No. Corey Stapleton. Who is Corey Stapleton? Yeah, what? Yeah, not this Corey Stapleton. Yes. He was a former Secretary of State of Montana, lost for the Republican primary to become member of the House in 2020. I'm a little worried for him, for whatever reason. He's a Republican from Billings. Got in a little trouble for money issues as Secretary of State too. But if nobody in his own state knows who he is, maybe he has other goals here. Okay, so, but then the biggie. In 1841, he came out publicly. Well, basically, he ordered everybody who had different revelations, shut up, I'm the only one. And then he announced that plural marriage. So, and this would be like the last straw for those living nearby, their own little isolated bubbles. You know, he's going to make himself president and force us to do this. He's calling our religious point of view, everything we believed in was wrong, and we're going against the actual Christian faith. And then you have plural marriage. It's 27 wives are normally what you see. The point is, it doesn't matter, except for the fact he now allowed for plural marriage. And that would be the last straw. In 1844, he'd be arrested by the county sheriff. And in the process, him and his brother would be lynched. Lynching is torturing somebody, usually involving pain, but it's a whole process, a horrific process. Basically, it's not even nothing to do with law, not just law, like they're not like, oh, he committed a crime. It's more like we're just going to make an example of him. And you can imagine the remaining of his followers, some scattered, but those who remained for the next few years felt very threatened. And that's when the decision was made to go to Utah. And they would follow one of Brigham, or one of Joseph Smith's chief lieutenants, Brigham Young. Might have been Joseph Smith's brother Hiram, but he was also lynched. And so they followed the Oregon Trail, but a little bit off, so they would be separate. So if you go there, it's the Mormon Trail. And this would be used by thousands up for the next 40 years. Some with nothing more than basically a wheelbarrow pushing their goods. And this is on the Mormon Trail, but this is 1880s. And they would go to the Great Salt Lake. Why there? Get out the country, get the heck out of the United States. But go to this basin that is dry. Salt Lake, I mean, who wants a Salt Lake? And so they could be isolated. It's very isolated. Surrounded by mountains on all sides. But it's kind of interesting to go into Salt Lake City, that long, it's just like the washouts front, that line of mountains. It does give you a feeling that you're got a wall there. And I love this picture. If you're not sure, this is what we call an old photo. If you're clear, it's not a new photo, it's an old one. This is old cut and paste. How they used to do it all the way up to the 1990s. And sometimes still do it. They would literally cut out the pictures, cut it out as carefully as they can. Cut out a picture of Brigham Young, cut out a picture of Joseph Smith, put them on top of each other on this one. Then they painted the edges to kind of soften the edges. And then they take another photo of it. That's how they did it. So this was quite the art. And you could tell it's a little bit off, but they painted the edges. Here they try to paint the cheeks, but the paint smothers. So you get that. And so there they created Salt Lake City. And Brigham Young personally laid out Salt Lake City. And I'll say this, of all the relatively big cities I've been to, Salt Lake City is probably the easiest one to get around in. Boy, is it easy to get around. Most cities, they're kind of haphazardly made. This was very well organized. But last thing about here, we'll come back to Brigham Young. Right here, he might still have to run. So he sent an advanced team as a safety valve to a basically tiny, unknown little mission right here called Los Angeles. And this was going to be a safety valve in case they have to flee again. And they were talking about, they just heard about this group of islands called Samoa. You might go there. It's kind of ironic because Jews in Europe, when they were thinking about finding a homeland, they talked about Uganda and a few other places. They even talked about Samoa too. I was thinking, why Samoa? And then what about the people who live there? But that's going to have an important part of that faith. But yeah. There's already a little town there. But what they did is you're on the right track. They dug wells. They knew we don't know how long we're going to be there. And they dug and they tapped into the San Fernando Valley, or the San Fernando Aquifer. And this water allowed them to grow citrus trees for the big citrus orchards. And that would encourage people to go to Los Angeles. And that would help be the trigger to create Los Angeles, even though there's already a little village there. Yeah, so it's one of those interesting little quirks of faith. Or, then it was just, they kind of worked out that Los Angeles would be there. We will come back because the issue of slavery in the territory will wrap them up again. By the way, they're going to be very shocked when they're going to be back in the U.S. They thought about it. So slavery in the territories will be the issue that will lead the Civil War. Slavery in the territories. And you can see this how diffusion worked. Here at 1790, the darker the red, the more slaves. 1830, look how much it's expanded. And then think about all of this land they had just stolen and taken from those tribes here. Just going to be this wave of plantations. So there's 1830, and look at 1860. Look at the massive numbers of plantations and forced labor right here. I mean, you can really see the big areas of slavery here, here, and all along here. In fact, it kind of coincided with this deep, rich soil right here. So the slave trade along the black belt of soil. Yeah.
On the mountain.
Yeah.
There was like.
This one?
Yeah, because there was like a lot of slavery above, like Missouri and stuff. So I was gonna ask if that was before the 46.
Remember, 3630 only applied to Louisiana Purchase. So it didn't have anything to do with here. And you might also notice there's slavery up here, even though they didn't have slave codes. It was much more difficult to have slaves, but they had slaves up there. And there was still slavery up here in those times, Michigan, not that many without slave codes, but they did have those. And you'll also notice, look, we're also slaves on this one. Up in Nebraska, and yes, they started as anti-slavery, but they wanted to be part of the US too, the Mormons who lived there. We'll come back to that. So with that, Texas though will be the symbol of all. So Texas was the #1 issue. That was the biggest political issue of this era, and nobody wanted to touch it. In 1821, Mexico won their independence. And don't forget, Mexico is huge. It goes all the way from here down to Guatemala, the Yucatan. It's a massive country. Now, most of what you consider to be Mexicans live way down here. There's a few immigrants from Mexico here and around Santa Fe, a few little spots in California, but not very many. And then this massive high plateau, beautiful, but high plateau desert here. And the furthest eastern province, this Father Hidalgo was the leaders of the revolution. Very famous picture from Mexico City right here. Tejas was the easternmost province right here, and therefore the most vulnerable, but had some of the best potential land for agriculture. And so Mexico looked at this and said, if we're going to hold on to this vast country, we need citizens here. Hardy citizens. Where are we going to find people who are desperate for land? Who might be right on the border? They began to encourage immigrants from the United States. All they had to do is swear an oath saying I'm a Mexican citizen and become Catholic. And the thought was that they would be assimilated into Tejano culture. Mexican. And that was the plan. And this is one of these moments that if you were a patriotic Mexican, you would look at this and say, don't do it. This will be a horrific mistake. Because when the American citizens went there, oh, sure, they might have said, yeah, I'll do this oath. Sure, I'm Catholic. What did they bring with them? Not just slaves. The flag. They still thought themselves as being from the United States. They never thought of themselves as Mexicans. And they're different. They speak a different language, different culture, they're different. And yes, we're coming to slaves. And so, one more thing though. Texas would be dominated, at least in the 1850s, by a relatively small population of American Indians, but fierce warriors of the plains, the Wichita, the Kiowa, and then of course the Comanche. The Comanche took to the horse in the 16th century like nobody did. These small, fleet, quick ponies, they could ride, sometimes with stirrups, usually just a little bit of rope, they would hold their feet on there, but they became masters on the horse, to the point where the story was, Comanche men had trouble walking, but on the horse, they were like glued to the horse. And the stories about them be trained, they could like, while the horse is running at full gallop, go around the neck and get back on, using the neck as shields to jump on and jump off. But the big thing is they can fire 10 to 15 arrows, small little compact bows, from horseback. Not only 10 to 15 a minute, I'm sorry, accurately, but hang under the horse's neck and fire without stirrups, mind you. Fire accurately. The story is they get at 50 paces, hit the knot of a tree. From full gallop on a horse. So think about Mexican militia, Tejano militia with muzzle loading muskets. Might take 2 to 3, maybe 2 to 3 rounds a minute at best. And there's 10 to 15 arrows on it. They controlled the plains. And so the Comanches, it would be the Colt revolver firepower. Now we change that. But a few did brave it. Stephen Austin got a deal with the Mexican government to have this area. It's literally going to be called Austin's Land. And he would encourage American immigrants, they would all go through the right hand up, pledge to be a Mexican citizen and move here. But once word hit that there's great land in Texas, and just like that painting of the Oregon Valley, it's great land and easy trip. There's no troubles in Texas. Thousands more followed as squatters. And these immigrants from the United States soon became known as kind of a bastardization of chaos, Texans. And they move westward. Remember, squatters are ones who sit on land and they don't technically have a legal claim. And so there's no swearing a loyalty oath. There's no conversion. They're coming to get land. And soon all these people who, for whatever reason, didn't make it in the United States, things went bad. Let's get free land in Texas. So this was a pretty rough crew coming in. And they were definitely different than the Tejanos who lived here. And yes, they brought their slaves with them. So these forced marches of miserable slaves would go in, chained at the leg. And yes, as they're all chained together, they would always be preceded by fiddlers, other slaves. So they had some music to keep all in the same state. Because they're all chained together. And these unimaginable hell of these slave chain gangs or trains, they call them, going through. This was all over the South. This was a normal, routine thing to see in this era. Slaves from Virginia being sold down to Mississippi, people dragging their slaves into Texas. Hell on earth. And they brought them in and they saw themselves as Americans. And one of the things that made them American, slaves. And so with that, the government of Mexico tried to be a republic. There was a civil war in the Yucatan called the Caste War that kind of went on for, I don't know, 100 years. And it was hard to, California, there was rumblings of the people here. They're like, we don't want to be part of Mexico. Here, San Antonio looked at it, Mexico City's 1,000 miles away. You can't tell us what to do. So there's rumbling already. The government is weak. Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he would be elected president and then make himself dictator. And he had to figure out a way to hold it together. He decided no more immigrants. They're destabilizing the country. But how do you deal with those who are there? Abolish slavery. So he cut off the immigrants, which to the Texans who went there, this was seen as a massive blow because we're going to be outnumbered. And then no slavery. And then he began to crack down on the local government there. So basically saying, okay, self-government's over for those who live there, no slavery, no more immigrants. There would be a little bit of a revolt against us at first, and the local government, that's going to trigger even a bigger revolt. I should add, that is the trigger. What's going to be the War of Texan Independence will be over slavery. They ban slavery. Now, Texas will claim this is for liberty and this is for our rights as, they're going to say Americans, but slavery was the key. The War for Texas Independence. Yeah.
I bet they're like, how dare you take away our liberty to take away other people's liberty?
They wouldn't have said that second part, but that's exactly what they said. And this is going to be a 2-year war. One of the big things was they overran a tiny little garrison at Gonzales, got the cannon, and then pushed back a tiny little Mexican force. There's almost no Mexican soldiers up there. They tried to take away the cannon. And this would be the flag they would scrawl on a piece of canvas. Come and take the cannon we got. And so this would become really to represent that defiant attitude that the Texans have. And they still act like they have it too. I would say act like it because there's a lot of myth. But if you've been to Texas, you probably know what I'm talking about. Has anyone seen that flag before? Yeah, that's a pretty famous one. Now, it's going to be made up of Texans who are American immigrants and Tejanos. These are Mexican citizens. A lot of them are Spanish American blood, but they're both, they don't like being governed from Mexico City and this dictator. You could probably guess which one after the war is probably going to lose everything. Which one of these two? Well, Santa Anna decided he's got to put this down now. He borrowed a bunch of money. They issued a bunch of bonds, drafted a bunch of men, and marched across the desert. To meet him, the Texans will choose Sam Houston. Houston was from Tennessee. He was a member of Congress. He, a very intelligent man, a protege of Andrew Jackson. And after his wife died, he turned to drinking. He resigned from Congress and got a new start. He went to Texas. And since he had experience in the War of 1812 and fighting on the frontier, they made him the commander, and his goal is to save the army. Remember the American Revolution? What the colonists had to do to survive is just keep the army together. And that's what Sam Houston decided. Let's pull back and let the Mexicans march into this drier, inhospitable land up here. Not as dry as here, but that was a plan. Pretty good plan. Of course, nobody would want to do that. They want to fight. Being way outnumbered. And so, we're coming to the Battle of the Alamo. Santa Anna divided his force, 10,000 men, into two columns. And they marched into Tejas. Tejas is this area, kind of eastern Texas today. One along the southern path towards Austin's colony, the other one towards the key town of San Antonio. At San Antonio was an old Spanish mission called the Alamo. And you think about what the threat of Comanche attack, it was like a little fort. It had walls, some of the walls were as high as 16 feet around a massive field that was also for grazing of animals, some farms. They had barracks, they had dormitories, they had a blacksmith shop, and a church. So, in February, the Mexican army got here. You notice they did in the winter because of the weather. That is how big that mission was. If you go there today, all that's left is this. And they just about tore that down many different times. Well, Colonel Travis was a lawyer. Remember, there's going to be militias there. Comanche attack and slave rebellion. They have militias. Travis had a bunch of these little kind of irregular forces at the Alamo, and Houston ordered him evacuated. It's a trap. Travis decided, no, I'm going to stay. And we're going to extract as much blood from the Mexican army as possible. Remember the Battle of Bunker Hill? How the British kept attacking and just got mowed down? He wanted that. So then they could say to the Mexicans, are you sure you want to go on with this? Is it worth the blood? He had kind of this martyr's complex, and yeah, he should never have stayed here. But when the Mexicans arrived on February 22nd, 23rd, he should have evacuated. He didn't. So he's bottled up. And that's going to lead to a week and a half long siege. When the Mexicans surrounded him, they tried to give him a chance to surrender. He refused. And so on this. Well, that's from the movie. I put a little scene from the movie, but it didn't work. And then it's still somehow the legacy remained on this. Well, Davy Crockett, another failed Tennessee politician, he just happened to arrive at the Alamo from Tennessee, another one of these, my last chance to make it. He also wanted to reestablish his political career. He was a Whig. I'll talk about him a little bit more in a sec. But he showed up with a few other from Tennessee. And since he was the most famous man who was out there, it's going to be known as, there's going to be a lot of things about Davy Crockett, the Alamo, Davy Crockett's Last Stand. Here he is here. This is from a comic book. And this is one of the more famous pictures of him beating up Mexicans as he fought to the death. He would get there, and this very famous Whig politician will come back to him, but he too would die there. But what happened was, I have the picture here, yeah. The Mexicans, they outnumbered him by a lot. There are only a couple hundred Texans in the Alamo, so they didn't have enough men to cover all the entire wall. So they could only cover a few spots. So what they did is they faked an attack here, and then a main attack on this wall. It was 16 feet high. The few Texans on that wall, there's a little firing stuff, and then they're standing with their muskets over the wall. Now think about, they're standing like this. They can fire one, then reload, fire again when the Mexicans charge. But see what happened when they got to about 20 feet. You see it, what happens? It's a blind spot, isn't it? That kind of bend over. And so once the Mexicans got to within 20 feet, they carried ladders, they climbed over the top and overwhelmed it. It happened. It just overwhelmed. They just didn't have enough men. It was a trap. They never should have stayed there. Most of the men surrendered. And they were all executed. When Santa Anna attacked, they attacked the black flag. No. Santa Anna was going to make an example of those at the Alamo. If you resist, you're dead. What Santa Anna was thinking was, if we slaughtered those first 3 here, those Texans will run away back to the Mexicans. And locked in. They called it runaways. But they lined them up and shot them. Well, at the same time, at Goliath, weeks later, but the same 500 Texans surrendered. Basically, they got outmaneuvered. They walked out into this dry area without water. And like, oh, we don't have any water. We surrendered. They foolishly stumbled into being surrendered. Now, before we get to what happened here, this was one of their flags, and you got to admit, that's really cool and confusing. Did he just like cut his own arm off? Ah! And they made a flag? What's going to happen to him at Goliath? All shot. Have you ever been to the Alamo? It is pretty cool. You been there? Anybody else been there? Road trip. San Antonio's kind of a neat town. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. I thought I got rid of that little sound thing. Better leave this up for everybody. This actually makes my stomach hurt looking.
My dad texted me something. The whole advocate thing is like, I looked at it, was like,